Some women wear diamonds to weddings. Others wear sacrifice so quietly nobody notices until it's too late. I should have understood what kind of evening it was the moment the waiter handed me a tray of champagne and asked if I worked for the catering company. For one strange second, I actually smiled politely and reached for a glass before realizing what he meant. "Oh no," I said softly. "I'm the groom's mother." The young man's face turned red instantly. "I'm so sorry, ma'am." But before he could step away, I heard laughter behind me. Light, controlled, elegant laughter. Victoria Langford, Chloe's mother. She stood near the entrance of the ballroom in a champagne-colored designer gown, one manicured hand resting against her diamond bracelet, while several guests surrounded her like satellites around the moon. "Honestly," she said with a small smile, "it's an easy mistake." A few people chuckled quietly, not cruelly, not loudly, which somehow made it hurt even more. I tightened my fingers around the small silver clutch hanging from my wrist and pretended not to notice the heat rising into my cheeks. The ballroom at the Fairmont Grand Hotel glowed under warm golden chandeliers. White orchids spilled from crystal vases taller than some children. A string quartet played near the dance floor while servers carried trays of lobster appetizers and imported champagne through the crowd. Everything looked expensive, polished, perfect. And standing there in my navy blue dress that I'd spent 3 weeks saving for, I suddenly felt like a stain nobody wanted to point out directly. Still, I smiled, because I had not spent 39 years raising Daniel Carter alone just to fall apart in the middle of his wedding reception. I raised that boy working double shifts at a roadside diner outside Milwaukee after his father died. I folded napkins at night until my fingers cracked in winter. I missed birthdays, skipped meals, sold my wedding ring to help pay for Daniel's first year of law school. And tonight, as I stood beneath those golden lights watching wealthy strangers sip champagne worth more than my weekly grocery bill, my son barely looked at me. Daniel stood near the center of the ballroom beside Chloe, smiling for photographs beneath a wall of white roses. Tall, confident, expensive tuxedo tailored perfectly across his shoulders. For a moment, pride filled my chest so suddenly it almost hurt. He looked successful, respected, loved, everything I ever wanted for him. Then his eyes met mine across the room, and almost immediately drifted away toward Victoria again. That tiny movement hurt more than the waiter's mistake ever could. A woman beside me leaned closer and whispered gently, "Are you from the bride's side?" I looked toward Daniel again before answering. "No," I said quietly. "I'm his mother." The woman gave me a polite smile before turning back toward her husband, but I noticed the tiny shift in her expression after hearing my answer. Sympathy. That quiet kind people try to hide at formal events because they do not want to embarrass you further. I had seen that look before. Usually from teachers at parent conferences when Daniel was young and I arrived wearing a diner uniform that smelled faintly of coffee and fried onions. I looked away before she could say anything else and focused on the ballroom instead. Waiters moved gracefully beneath the chandeliers while soft piano music replaced the string quartet. Somewhere near the dance floor, guests laughed loudly over expensive whiskey and stories about ski trips in Aspen. Everything about the evening felt carefully designed to impress people with money. Even the flowers smelled expensive. White orchids, imported roses, fresh eucalyptus woven around gold candle holders. Chloe had always loved elegant things. I remembered the first time Daniel brought her to my little house outside Milwaukee almost 4 years earlier. She stood in my kitchen wearing cream-colored boots that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. Yet she had hugged me warmly and said, "Daniel talks about you all the time." Back then I believed her. I believed all of them. "Mom." Daniel's voice startled me gently from behind. I turned quickly, my heart lifting before I could stop it. For just a second he looked like the boy who used to run into my arms after Little League games. "You made it," he said quietly. Not, "You look beautiful." Not, "I am glad you are here." Just, "You made it." I smiled anyway. Of course I did. His eyes flickered briefly toward Victoria across the ballroom. She was speaking with several guests while occasionally glancing in our direction like someone monitoring a situation she did not fully trust. Daniel loosened his bow tie slightly. "Listen, if tonight feels a little overwhelming, do not take anything personally. Chloe's family is just very formal." Formal. That word settled heavily inside my chest. Formal did not explain the waiter mistaking me for staff. Formal did not explain the way Victoria introduced me earlier to one of her friends as Daniel's hard-working little mother from Wisconsin. Little mother. As though I were some charming detail attached to my son's success story. I am fine, I said softly. Daniel nodded too quickly, clearly relieved. Then someone called his name from across the room. A photographer waved impatiently near the staircase wrapped in white roses. I have to go take more pictures, he said. We will talk later, okay? I opened my mouth to answer, but he was already turning away. I watched him disappear into the crowd beside Chloe while flashes from the cameras lit up the ballroom in bursts of white light. And suddenly, standing there alone among 200 beautifully dressed strangers, I realized something painful. My son was nervous all evening. Not because he was getting married, because he was afraid I might embarrass him. The wedding coordinator announced dinner 20 minutes later, and guests slowly drifted toward the reception hall beneath soft amber lighting that made everything glow warm and golden. I followed the crowd carefully, smoothing invisible wrinkles from my dress while balancing my clutch against my side. For a brief moment, I told myself perhaps I had imagined the tension. Weddings were stressful. Families were complicated. Maybe I was simply overtired and emotional after the long drive from Wisconsin. Then I found my table. Table 27. Near the service doors. Close enough to hear dishes clattering behind the kitchen wall every few minutes. I stared at the seating chart again just to make sure there had not been a mistake. Most immediate family members sat near the dance floor beneath floating candles and floral centerpieces. Daniel and Chloe's college friends occupied the middle section beside the stage. Even distant cousins sat closer than I did. But the groom's mother had been placed beside strangers near the back corner of the ballroom where servers entered carrying trays of food. A middle-aged man at my table gave me an awkward smile. Looks like we got the overflow section. His wife elbowed him softly as if warning him not to say too much. I pulled out my chair slowly and sat down. The gold place card in front of me simply read, Evelyn. No last name. No title. Nothing else. Across the ballroom, I noticed Victoria laughing beside a group of women dressed in glittering evening gowns. One of them leaned toward her and whispered something while glancing in my direction. Victoria lowered her champagne glass and gave the smallest shrug imaginable. It was subtle, elegant, practiced, but I knew exactly what it meant. A few minutes later, dinner service began. Waiters carried plates of filet mignon and roasted sea bass through the ballroom while soft jazz played overhead. The smell of garlic butter and fresh bread filled the air. I realized suddenly that I had barely eaten all day. My stomach tightened painfully as I reached for my water glass. Then the large projection screen near the stage flickered to life. A special presentation honoring Daniel and Chloe, the announcer said warmly. Guests applauded while photographs began appearing across the screen. Chloe as a little girl at horseback riding competitions. Chloe vacationing in Italy with her family. Chloe graduating from Northwestern University. Then Daniel appeared beside her in newer photographs. Luxury vacations. Wine tastings. Charity galas. Expensive smiles. Expensive clothes. Expensive lives. I kept waiting for older pictures. Pictures from before all of this. Daniel at 8 years old wearing a baseball uniform 2 sizes too big, because I could not afford a new one that season. Daniel blowing out birthday candles in our tiny kitchen while I held the cake steady. With tired hands after a double shift. Daniel opening the acceptance letter to law school while crying so hard he could barely read it aloud. None of those pictures appeared. It was as though my son's life had only begun after wealthy people entered it. I felt something cold settle quietly inside my chest then. Not anger yet. Something sadder than anger. Erasure. By the time dessert arrived, the ballroom had grown louder with wine and celebration. Crystal glasses clinked beneath the chandeliers while guests leaned closer across candlelit tables telling stories that sounded polished and expensive. I sat quietly, barely touching the slice of lemon cake placed in front of me. Every few minutes another guest walked past my table without noticing me at all. It was strange, watching your own child's wedding like an outsider looking through glass. Then I heard Victoria's voice rise smoothly above the room. Before the dancing begins, she announced, tapping lightly against her champagne glass, I would love to say a few words about family. Conversations faded almost instantly. The spotlight near the stage shifted toward her while servers stepped aside respectfully. Victoria stood poised in the center of the ballroom like she had rehearsed this moment for weeks. Maybe she had. "Tonight is not only about love," she said warmly, her voice carrying easily through the speakers. "It is about legacy values and the families who shape us into the people we become." Guests nodded approvingly. Daniel stood beside Chloe near the dance floor with one hand resting gently against her waist. He looked nervous again. I noticed it immediately. The tightness in his shoulders. The way he avoided looking toward me. Victoria continued smiling. "I always taught Chloe that grace matters. Presentation matters. The company we keep matters." Soft laughter moved through several tables. Because no matter how successful someone becomes, people never fully escape where they come from. Something in the room shifted then. Tiny. Almost invisible. But I felt it. Victoria slowly turned her gaze across the ballroom until it landed directly on me. 200 people followed her eyes without realizing it. "Of course," she added sweetly. "Some people are fortunate enough to adapt beautifully into elegant spaces." A few guests smiled politely, unsure whether they were supposed to laugh. "And others?" She paused just long enough. "Well, let us just say good manners cannot always be taught later in life." This time several uncomfortable chuckles scattered through the ballroom before quickly dying out. I felt heat crawl slowly up my neck. My hands remained folded calmly in my lap, but inside my chest something cracked quietly open. Not because of Victoria. Not even because of the guests staring at me now with curiosity and embarrassment mixed together. No, the real pain came from Daniel. Because my son heard every word. And stayed silent. He lowered his eyes toward the floor while Chloe squeezed his arm gently as though comforting him for enduring something awkward. In that moment I realized they had discussed me before tonight. Maybe many times. My simple house. My waitress years. My accent that still carried traces of Wisconsin despite decades trying to soften it. Suddenly every unanswered phone call over the past year made sense. Every holiday visit shortened early. Every awkward silence whenever I mentioned old family memories. They were not drifting away from me accidentally. They were editing me out of the story they wanted to tell the world. And somehow, that realization hurt more than public humiliation ever could. The applause after Victoria's speech sounded thin and uncomfortable, like people clapping simply because silence would have been worse. I kept my smile in place anyway. Years of customer service had taught me how to survive humiliation gracefully. You learn very quickly as a waitress that dignity sometimes depends on pretending you do not notice when people look down on you. Across the ballroom, Daniel finally glanced toward me again. For one brief second, guilt flashed across his face. Then the wedding band started playing louder, drowning everything beneath cheerful music, and the moment disappeared. Guests returned to drinking and laughing as if nothing unusual had happened. That was the strange thing about public cruelty. Most people preferred pretending they had not witnessed it. I pushed my chair back slowly and stood, needing air more than food. The ballroom suddenly felt too warm, too crowded, too carefully beautiful. I walked past the dance floor where Chloe was hugging relatives beneath soft golden lights. Nobody stopped me. Nobody asked if I was all right. Near the hallway leading toward the restrooms, the noise faded into distant echoes. Marble floors reflected dim amber wall lights while enormous flower arrangements filled the corridor with the scent of roses and eucalyptus. For the first time all evening I could breathe normally again. I leaned lightly against the wall and closed my eyes for a moment. "Evelyn," a man's voice said gently behind me. I turned slowly. The gentleman standing there appeared to be around 70 years old, silver-haired, tall, wearing a dark charcoal suit that looked expensive without trying too hard. His expression held something I had not seen all night. Recognition. "I thought that was you," he said warmly. "Harold Whitman." For a second the name meant nothing. Then memory hit me all at once. "Harold?" I blinked in surprise. "From Milwaukee Financial Group?" He smiled softly. "Your husband and I worked together for almost 15 years. My chest tightened instantly at the mention of Thomas. Even after 20 years, hearing my husband's name still carried a quiet ache. Harold studied my face carefully before speaking again. I was very sorry to hear about Victoria's little speech. I tried to laugh it off politely. Oh, it is her daughter's wedding. Emotions run high. Harold's eyes narrowed slightly. No, Evelyn. That was not emotion. That was deliberate. The calm certainty in his voice unsettled me more than the insult itself had. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Thomas used to tell me you were the strongest person he ever knew. Watching tonight, I think he was right. I looked down at my hands then because suddenly I felt dangerously close to crying, and I refused to do that in this hallway. Harold remained quiet for a moment before adding something unexpected. There is something important you should know. Something your son clearly does not. Slowly, I lifted my eyes back toward him. His expression had changed completely now. Serious. Careful. Almost concerned. Your husband protected you far more than you realize, Evelyn. And for the first time that evening, Victoria Langford no longer felt like the most dangerous person in the building. For several seconds, I simply stared at Harold without speaking. The distant sound of laughter drifted through the ballroom doors behind us while soft jazz echoed faintly down the hallway. Everything around me still looked elegant and beautiful. Yet suddenly the evening felt entirely different. I do not understand, I said quietly. Harold glanced once toward the ballroom before lowering his voice further. Thomas never trusted people who valued appearances too much, especially after Daniel started working with the Langford family. Hearing my son's name spoken with concern sent a chill through me. Harold folded his hands calmly in front of him. About 8 years ago, when Daniel was finishing law school, Thomas made several financial decisions very quietly. Most people assumed he left only the house and life insurance after he passed away. I frowned slightly, because that is what he left. Harold gave me a sad smile. No, Evelyn. That is what he allowed everyone to believe. My heart began beating harder then. I remembered those final months before Thomas died from heart failure. The hospital visits. The medication spread across the kitchen counter. The nights he stayed awake staring silently through the living room window after Daniel left for Chicago. Back then I thought he was simply afraid of dying. Now I wondered if he had been afraid of something else. Harold continued carefully. Your husband created an investment trust long before his condition worsened. Quietly. Legally. And he placed the controlling authority entirely under your name. I blinked in confusion. That cannot be right. We were never wealthy people. You were not poor either, Harold replied gently. Thomas invested early in several manufacturing properties outside Milwaukee. One of those developments became extremely valuable during the last decade. I stared at him in disbelief while trying to process the words. Investment trust. Controlling authority. None of it sounded connected to my life. I had spent the last 20 years budgeting grocery bills and clipping coupons from newspapers on Sunday mornings. Why would Thomas hide something like that from Daniel? I whispered. Harold's expression darkened slightly. Because your husband worried that success was changing him. The hallway suddenly felt colder despite the warm lighting overhead. I looked toward the ballroom doors again where music pulsed softly through the walls. Inside that room, Daniel was probably smiling for photographs beside people who believed wealth made them important. Thomas told me something once, Harold said quietly. He said if Daniel ever became embarrassed by the sacrifices that built his future, then he was not ready to inherit the truth yet. My throat tightened painfully. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then Harold reached slowly into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and removed a cream-colored business envelope. I did not plan to bring this tonight, he admitted. But after what I witnessed in there, I think your husband would want you to have it now. He handed me the envelope carefully. My fingers trembled slightly as I looked down at my own name written across the front in Thomas's handwriting. Suddenly the wedding music behind those ballroom doors no longer sounded joyful to me. It sounded distant. Fragile. Like something moments away from breaking apart. My fingers remained frozen around the envelope even after Harold stepped away to answer a phone call near the elevators. I could barely breathe. Seeing Thomas's handwriting again after all these years felt like hearing the voice of someone I had buried twice. Around me, hotel staff moved quietly through the hallway carrying silver trays and folded table linens, completely unaware that my entire understanding of my marriage had just shifted beneath my feet. Slowly, I opened the envelope. Inside was a folded letter and a smaller legal document clipped behind it. The paper trembled slightly in my hands as I unfolded the letter first. Evelyn, if you are reading this, then something has gone wrong. Those were the first words. Immediately, tears blurred my vision. Thomas had always written exactly the way he spoke. Calm, careful, direct. I swallowed hard and kept reading. I know you will try to defend Daniel because that is who you are. But love should never require humiliation. If our son ever allows anyone to make you feel small, then he has forgotten the sacrifices that built his future. I closed my eyes briefly. Down the hallway, the ballroom doors opened for a moment and laughter spilled outward beneath bright music before fading again. Two entirely different worlds existed only a few feet apart. Thomas's letter continued. The trust belongs to you completely. Harold has the full documents. Nobody can access or transfer the assets without your approval. Not Daniel. Not his future family. Nobody. I looked down at the second document clipped behind the letter. Most of the legal language blurred together in my emotional state, but several numbers stood out immediately. Property holdings. Investment accounts. Commercial developments. The totals were far larger than anything I had ever imagined connected to our family. My hands began shaking harder. Suddenly memories returned in painful fragments. Thomas working late in the garage after dinner reviewing paperwork he never explained. Business calls he always took outside. The quiet arguments we once had because I thought he worried too much about money despite our modest lifestyle. All those years, he had been building something silently. Not for himself. For me. Mrs. Carter? A young voice interrupted gently. I looked up quickly. One of the wedding staff stood nearby holding a silver tray with fresh champagne glasses. They are about to begin the parent recognition dance, she explained politely. The groom asked if someone could come find you. For several seconds I simply stared at her. The parent recognition dance. The irony almost made me laugh out loud. After everything tonight, after being hidden, minimized, quietly erased, now they wanted me visible again because the wedding schedule required it. I folded Thomas's letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. Then I looked toward the ballroom doors one more time. The music inside had softened into a slow piano melody beneath warm golden lights. Beautiful, elegant, fragile. And suddenly, for the first time all evening, I no longer felt ashamed walking back into that room. Because the woman returning to the ballroom was not the lonely waitress Victoria Langford believed she could humiliate. She was the legal owner of a legacy none of them even knew existed yet. When I stepped back into the ballroom, the atmosphere had changed slightly. The lights were dimmer now, softer, casting warm reflections across crystal glasses and polished marble floors. Couples stood near the dance floor waiting for the parent recognition dance, while photographers adjusted their cameras near the stage. Nobody noticed the envelope tucked carefully inside my clutch. Nobody noticed that something inside me had shifted completely. Daniel spotted me almost immediately. Relief flashed across his face as he hurried through the crowd toward me. "Mom," he said quietly, "where did you go? They were looking for you." His voice sounded tense again. Controlled. Like a man trying desperately to keep the evening smooth and presentable. I looked at him carefully beneath the golden ballroom lights. For the first time all night I noticed how tired he looked. Not physically tired. Spiritually tired. Like someone who had spent too many years trying to belong in rooms that demanded he forget where he came from. "I needed some air," I answered softly. Daniel nodded quickly before glancing around to make sure nobody was listening. "Listen, about Victoria earlier." He stopped halfway through the sentence, unable to finish it, because there was no excuse large enough for silence. Before I could respond, the microphone squealed gently near the stage. Harold Whitman had stepped beside the wedding coordinator. My heartbeat slowed instantly. Something about his expression told me this moment was no accident. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harold announced warmly, "before the next dance begins, I would like to recognize someone very special tonight." Conversations faded across the ballroom. Victoria looked mildly irritated by the interruption while Chloe exchanged a confused glance with Daniel. Harold smiled calmly and continued. "Many of you know me through the Langford Development Group. What most people do not know is that none of those projects would have existed without one remarkable family. I saw Victoria straighten slightly at that. Several business guests turned toward the stage with sudden interest. Harold lifted his champagne glass gently toward me across the ballroom. 25 years ago, Thomas Carter made an investment that helped save one of our earliest commercial properties during a financial collapse. But the person who truly protected that legacy after his death, he paused deliberately, was his wife, Evelyn Carter. Silence spread slowly through the room, confused at first, then attentive. I saw Victoria's smile begin to fade. Harold continued calmly. In fact, Mrs. Carter remains the controlling owner of several investment holdings connected to the Langford commercial expansion projects, still operating today. It felt as though all the oxygen disappeared from the ballroom at once. Guests turned toward me so quickly it almost looked choreographed. Daniel stared at Harold in complete disbelief. Chloe's expression froze. And Victoria? Victoria looked like someone had suddenly pulled the floor out from beneath her perfectly polished world. For several long seconds nobody spoke. Then Harold smiled softly toward me again and raised his glass higher. To Evelyn Carter, he said warmly. A woman whose grace tonight impressed me far more than wealth ever could. This time when the applause began, it was not thin or uncomfortable. And for the first time all evening, Victoria Langford could not meet my eyes. The rest of the ballroom felt strangely unsteady after that. Not chaotic. Not loud, just different. Conversations became quieter, more careful. Guests who had barely acknowledged me all evening suddenly smiled as I passed. A few even introduced themselves politely, as though trying to repair something invisible that had already broken hours ago. I accepted every handshake with calm grace. Not because I needed their approval anymore, but because Thomas had been right. Dignity reveals people more clearly than anger ever does. Across the room, Victoria remained frozen beside her table holding a champagne glass she no longer seemed interested in drinking. The confidence that had wrapped around her all evening like perfume was gone now. In its place sat something far less elegant. Fear. Not fear of losing money. People like Victoria never feared money itself. They feared losing status, losing control, losing the illusion that they were superior to everyone around them. Daniel approached me slowly near the edge of the dance floor while couples began gathering for the next song. His face looked pale beneath the warm ballroom lighting. "Mom," he said quietly. Just that single word. And suddenly he sounded young again. Lost again. I looked at him for several seconds before answering. "Did you know?" My voice stayed soft, calm. That seemed to hurt him more than shouting ever could have. Daniel shook his head immediately. "I swear to you, I did not know any of this existed." I believed him. That was the painful part. My son had not betrayed me for money. He had betrayed me for acceptance, for approval, for a seat at tables filled with wealthy people who laughed at women like me behind crystal glasses and candlelight. "I should have said something earlier," he whispered. When Victoria made those comments, he stopped again, guilt tightening across his face. "I am sorry." The music shifted softly into a piano melody, while couples moved slowly onto the dance floor beneath floating lights. Somewhere nearby, guests continued whispering about Harold's announcement and the Carter investments connected to the Langford developments. But suddenly none of that mattered to me anymore. I looked at my son standing there in his expensive tuxedo, shoulders heavy with shame, and realized something heartbreaking. Success had given him everything except peace. I reached up gently and straightened the front of his bow tie the same way I used to before school concerts when he was little. Daniel's eyes filled instantly. "Listen to me carefully," I said softly. "Money was never the test tonight." He swallowed hard without speaking. Character was. For a moment neither of us moved. Then I stepped back slowly and glanced toward the ballroom entrance where cool night air waited beyond the glass doors. "Where are you going?" Daniel asked quietly. I smiled at him one last time. A real smile this time. Not forced. Not wounded. Free. "Home," I answered. As I walked toward the exit, I heard the music swelling behind me beneath golden lights and expensive laughter. But for the first time all evening, none of it felt important anymore. Because the woman leaving that ballroom was no longer invisible. And deep down, My son finally understood exactly when he lost sight of her.